Welcome back to SimpleBibleProphecy.com. This is Lesson 6, Daniel's 70th week, the future. I'm Pete, and of course you know Neb and the Rock by now. If you don't know Neb and the Rock, you really need to go back to the beginning because they are the key to the prophetic future. Last we left off, we were in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel had been visited by the archangel Gabriel. And so we're going to backtrack a little bit and go over the main topics of the vision. Now in that vision, Daniel was showed that there were 490 prophetic years pronounced over Israel and Jerusalem. And the time starts with a decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And that started a prophetic clock of 483 years. After the 483 years, the Messiah was to appear. Then the Messiah was to be killed. And the temple and the Jerusalem were to be destroyed. The final 7 years of that 490 years would begin with a treaty with many nations, and the Antichrist is involved in that treaty. Halfway through the treaty, the Antichrist will break it and proclaim himself to be God in the temple. Then the Antichrist will eventually be defeated. So we've covered the 483 years in our last lesson. Now let's look at the final 7 years. I've been debating for a while on how to approach these final 7 years of prophecy, keeping it to just this one set of scriptures. But I don't want to just discuss this one scripture, but all the details throughout the Bible that go with it. Although these 4 scriptures are packed with information, it is but a tip of the iceberg. During this study, I will give out a few nuggets of some of the details. In putting together this prophecy puzzle, we have seen 2 corner pieces. The first corner piece was Neb's statue in the rock. It establishes the chronological order of the kingdoms that were to come. The second corner piece was Daniel's 70 weeks. It established a period of time inside the kingdoms. Now we have the third corner piece of the puzzle, Daniel's 70th week. It establishes a distinct period of time of 7 years that are now in the future. Remember, 483 years have passed. Now we're looking at the third corner piece, the 7 years that are in the future. And this is confined to one scripture, Daniel 9:27. And what I mean by this is there is no other scripture on Daniel's 70th week in the entire Bible. And I keep stating this because I want to emphasize it. Because according to this scripture, the final 7 years are broken into 2 halves, or 3.5 years each. And it starts with a covenant, or a peace agreement, or a treaty. This covenant will involve many nations, including Israel. And one surefire way to know that the start of this 7-year treaty will begin is when we see the rebuilding of the third temple, after the treaty has been signed. This is the key to tell the difference from the others. See, there have been other 7-year treaties. The Oslo Accords back in 1973, for one. It was a 7-year treaty with Israel, but it wasn't Daniel's 70th week. The rebuilding of the third temple is one of those controversial interpretations in the Christian faith. I'm simply basing my opinion on the following scriptures. I'm not limiting myself to these scriptures. There are other scriptures, but these scriptures were enough to convince me. Right there in the middle of Daniel 9:27, where it says, "But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering." Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're familiar with the Jewish faith, they can't do the sacrifices or the grain offerings without a temple. I also look at 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4, where it prophesies that the Antichrist will take his seat in the temple. There's also a Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, where it says the temple is given to the nations for 42 months. Also, in Jesus' own words, in Mathew chapter 24, verse 15, he talks about the abomination of standing in the temple. Now, there are those who will allegorize the temple away. I'm more of a literalist in my interpretations. See, because an allegory, by definition, lets someone interpret anything the way they see it. So if a scripture doesn't fit that someone's interpretation, they allegorize it. It's that simple. But to me, the rebuilding of the third temple is the absolute best way to tell if Daniel's 70th week has started. And it will be somewhere in that treaty so that you will know they're fixing to start building this temple. We also know that the Antichrist will be involved in some way, shape, or form in the 7-year covenant. He will not be revealed as the Antichrist at this time, but he will be involved. He will be someone that we can look to as a clue. Now, how do I know this? The he in verse 27 refers back to Daniel 9:26, and that is, the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, some say the he is actually Jesus Christ. However, the last part of the scripture says the he will be destroyed, and we know by Nebuchadnezzar's statue that Jesus, the rock, will reign forever. So that's null and void. And it's pretty simple to just nullify that interpretation of the he being Jesus Christ. Now, in the middle of the 7-year period, the Antichrist will be revealed. This is the time when we will find out, beyond the shadow of a doubt, who the Antichrist is. Are there other clues? Yes. Now, we know this revelation will come of the Antichrist because he will appear in the temple and he will proclaim himself to be God. He will also possibly sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple. Now, the pig is considered unclean by the Jews, and to sacrifice a pig on the temple would desecrate the temple. That's why they're saying the abomination of desolation. Some say that this will just be because the Antichrist will proclaim himself to be God. Others say it will be also because he sacrifices the pig on the altar. The abomination of desolation is listed in 2 scriptures, Daniel 9:27 and also Mathew 24:15. Now, the Antichrist will begin his time of wrath at the midway point, halfway in the middle of the Daniel's 70th week. Notice I said his time of wrath, not God's. You see, there are 2 wraths to come. That's just a little clue or a tidbit of information on some of the details that's coming up later on. Now, I'm going to give you some more detailed clues, all dealing with the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. There are 7 sets of scriptures that give us the second half of the final 7 years. And we will look at them just briefly here. We'll go into them more later in the detailed lessons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down these 7 sets of scriptures into 3 categories. These details so that you can review them and have a little bit better understanding about the 7-year period that we're about to face. Now, there is Daniel chapter 7, verses 23 through 25, where the Antichrist is persecuting the saints for time, times, and half a time. In other words, 3.5 years. In Daniel 12, verses 1 through 7, the Antichrist will persecute Israel for time, times, and half a time. Again, 3.5 years. But also in Revelation 12, verse 14, Israel is protected for time, times, and half a time. Again, 3.5 years. Now we're going to go to the second category, the 1260 days. Guess what? 1260 days equals 3.5 years. Revelation 12:6, Israel is protected for 1260 days. Then we'll look at Revelation 11, verse 3, where the 2 witnesses are protected for 1260 days. Then we have 42 months, which equals 3.5 years. Revelation 14, verse 7, the beast, or another name, the Antichrist, is given power for 42 months, or 3.5 years. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, the temple is given to the nation for 42 months, or 3.5 years. So when you get a chance, I'd like you to go back and look at these 7 sets of scriptures, these 7 sets of details of the 3.5 years. One thing I would like you to notice, most of the details are in Revelation, with the exception of the first 2 I gave you from Daniel. And if you read the complete set of scriptures around these details, notice where the wrath is coming from. Hint, It's not coming from God. If you read it carefully, you'll see that God is doing the protecting. That's a hint for the future. So I hope you'll join us for our next lesson, where we're going to take you to the future, because we're going to look at that fourth corner piece of the puzzle. And let me give you another hint that's not in the book of Daniel. It's in one of the other books, and I think you're going to be surprised when you find out which one it's in. So I hope I see you again in our next lesson, lesson 7. And remember what Jesus said, because I live, you shall also live. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.